Okay. Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, professors, academics, chief executives, farmers, food producers, policymakers, politicians, journalists, and of course Nuffield Scholars. And I give a special warm welcome to the international scholars from Australia, Ireland and Brazil. Friends, hopefully I haven't missed anyone out. So a very, very warm welcome to the first Nuffield Farming Lecture. My name is Dr. Louise Manning, and I'm a reader in food policy and management at Harper Adams University. But I stand here today as a trustee representing my fellow trustees and as chair of the committee, organising committee of the Nuffield Farming Lecture, to welcome you. I just wanted to set the scene a little for a couple of moments to explain and position the Nuffield Farming Lecture. The Nuffield Farming Lecture is a development of the Frank Arden Memorial Scholarship, and I've just been talking over coffee with Steve Ward, and I think we should remember Professor John Alston, who was at the forefront of the development of the first Nuffield Frank Arden Memorial. What we have tried to do with the Nuffield Farming Lecture is to develop and promote new thinking. No pressure, Michael. And develop and promote new thinking for the benefit of UK agriculture and society at large. And in doing so, promote the wider work of the Nuffield Farming Scholarship Trust. So, I will hand over shortly to Professor Sir Charles Godfrey, but we will have the presentation, then we will have a 15-minute talk between Sir Charles and Professor Michael Winter, and then 30 minutes of questions and answers. As I said, today we hope will be the seed to a whole range of new initiatives, and we hope this will put the trust at the centre of leading positive change in agriculture. So, thank you very much for listening. I am really looking forward to the next hour. Please can I ask Professor Giles Godfrey to come to the front. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Louise. It's a particular pleasure today to introduce Michael Winter, who's one of the most innovative thinkers about rural and environmental policy, and is also an old and personal friend. Michael read environmental studies at Y College and went on to do a PhD in sociology at the Open University. But since 2002, he's been at Exeter University, and is now a professor of land, economy and science in the Department of Politics. And he chairs the Centre for Rural Policy Research, which he co-directed from 2002 until 2015. We'd be here all day if I went through all the different things that Michael has been involved with, but I'll mention a couple. He's currently on a Natural England board and on JNCC. And previously, he was the founding chair of the Uplands Alliance. He sat on DEFRA's Science Advisory Council and was on the board of the Commission for Rural Communities. I guess in my world of the natural sciences, Michael is the go-to social scientist that we talk to if we want to understand some of the complexities of how humans and society interact with agricultural production and the environment. And from sitting on many different committees with Michael, he has a wonderful knack of sort of helping an interdisciplinary group of people work better together and come to conclusions. And personally, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with Michael or gone to one of his talks where I haven't come away feeling fascinated and better informed. So, Michael, I guess there's a first time for everything. So, with enormous pleasure, and no pressure there, I introduce Michael Winter to give today's lecture.
Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Charles and Louise, for your kind words. Yes, there is a first. I hope it won't be today. This has been a fascinating journey. Before I embark upon my paraphrase of that journey today, let me just, a few more thanks. I won't run through everything, but the funders for this, obviously very, very grateful to them. Numerous people who helped me along the way, giving advice as I went through this, and people I met on my travels, particularly in Denmark and Canada. It has been a personal journey. Obviously, it was going to be a physical journey in terms of going to places. But it's been quite a journey of adventure as well in terms of moving from my comfort zone, which for long has been farming. I'm from farming stock. I've always actually enjoyed going out on farms. I've enjoyed my little bit of smallholding. And in my academic work, I've basically looked at farmers, studied farmers, talked to farmers, thought about agricultural policy in the context of what farmers might do or might not do in response to policy change, and broadened it out around environmental issues as well. But what has come into this particular adventure has been food. I kind of always ate it. And when you open up my report, you'll see a sort of autobiographical bit quite early on about what I used to eat as a child and how that has changed. But I think like many people in these sort of academic and policy communities around farming and the environment, we tend to see food as the thing that, it's beyond our ken. Once farmers have done their stuff and produced the food, then it's there. It's in the marketplace. Consumers eat it. What I've done in this adventure is begun to look a little bit more at where food comes from. So I've moved out of my intellectual comfort zone from farming to food, and what I hadn't expected, because I was told to look at food culture, I rapidly moved to health. Because I discovered that you cannot look at the changes going on in the food environment in this world without immediately, very rapidly, becoming aware of what that means to people's health. So the context for this is going to be about from farming to food and from food to health. Just to make it more fun, believe me, I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. But in this journey over the last couple of years, well, we've had Brexit. We have Brexit. Do we have Brexit? We've had statements and policies coming out of Her Majesty's government, 25-year plan, health and harmony. And all this has been going on, and indeed is going on as we sit here. Who knows what news we'll pick up when we walk out of this room in an hour's time, because this is fast-moving territory, that is for sure. Food culture. What is it? Well, it's the what, the where, and how of what we eat. It's the social context. It's the relationships in which eating takes place. Eating is a social act. It's the meaning and significance we give to food. It's about identity. It's about ethics. In fact, it's about everything, isn't it? Without food, we would not be here. Understanding what we eat and how we eat it and where we eat it is vitally important, I think, for an industry that produces food to have a little bit of thought too. Exploring food culture, then what I came up with was this, it's not mine, it's from a really eminent and superb and exciting food sociologist called Alan Ward. And he talks about availability of food, acquisition of food, appropriation of food, and anxiety. I've always liked alliteration. It's great fun. And anxiety about food. So how food is, the manner in which food is provided and made available. And that takes us not only to agricultural production, to manufacturing, because that's hugely important. It takes us then to where we get our food from, to shopping, to budgeting, to cooking. All of this is spelt out in much more detail in the report, which I'm sure you will all read. I've been reduced to that tiny strip of plastic, as Louise has explained, but hopefully you will get into this in more detail than I can do in 40 minutes. Appropriation, the manner in which we consume food, and all those anxieties we have. And we're right to have anxieties. It is an intimate thing. What we take into our body affects who we are, what we are. It affects our future, our health. So it's not surprising people get anxious. Sometimes farmers get a little bit worried and a little bit fed up with the anxiety that's expressed. Well, people will continue to express anxiety about food. That is for sure. So, starting off with food availability, some big issues here. as our food culture has changed from nipping down to the sort of local stores and buying products that were largely produced in locality. That would have been the case in the 19th century. We've moved to a dependence on international trade, to a massively increased role for manufacturing processing, a big role for finance capital in all this as well. Food trade, exports. Well, here's just a few selected commodities and the extent of trade in those commodities. So we see up on the top there the big one, wheat, and how that is increased from 1961, dramatic increase in the amount of that is traded across the world, or is exported, across the world. So we're in a situation where more food is traded between nations than used to be the case. But not always as much as we might think. This is a sort of two-sided story here. Not all commodities are traded in the way that say, soya and wheat are. So this is the world exports as a percentage of total world production for selected crops and livestock. And you see there for soya, but it's kind of gone up from 1961, from about 15% up to sort of 35-40%. So that's significant. But a lot of the commodities that we're used to thinking about have kind of hovered down there, down the bottom, because they're bulky, because it's not always easy to trade. So I'm trying to paint a picture here of trade is important. We're part of a global trading system. We're part of a global food culture. Our diet is becoming more homogenous in many ways. But actually, it's quite interesting when you look at it commodity by commodity that there's quite a lot that is not yet quite in that export. Now, that could change very dramatically as time goes on. We could find more of that being traded. This is very interesting. What does this trade and this sort of move towards a global food system mean? A simple question. I'm not sure if I have the answer to this, actually. I think these are questions to tease and for people to enjoy. Have you got more diversity or less diversity? 7,000 plant species documented as human food, and yet big three provide half the world's plant-derived energy measured in calories: rice, wheat, and maize. Sometimes we have, I believe, a sort of illusion of diversity. I think it's very interesting. You look at breakfast cereals. I can go on and on about breakfast cereals, so I'll try not to, because I think it's been an extraordinary example of how business, in this case largely the manufacturing and processing business, managed to add value to something very, very basic. And if you just pause to think what we get from cereals in our diet, we can get from the raw stuff. Just eat a bowl of oats or porridge, unadulterated, unprocessed, there it is. Doesn't provide a lot of added value for the retail sector or for the processing sector. So cereals have been breakfast cereals are a great example of how you add value, how you market, how you have brand competition. Now, in recent times, that's changed a bit as the competition, if you like, has increased as mueslis and more natural, in inverted commas, products have come onto the market. But you still go into those supermarket aisles and you still see lots of that sort of stuff, and you see lots of little people thinking, well, sometimes you see lots of little people thinking, which one would I like? And it tends to have quite a lot of sugar in it. So is there more diversity, more choice? Well, if you go into a supermarket, it feels like that. Or is there an underlying sameness of the dietary offer? It's actually probably both of those are true. It can be very samey if you just go for certain things. You can make your diet more diverse if you want to. One thing is sure, and this is one of the things I found in Canada, looking at the First Nations, the Indigenous peoples' traditional diet. Very few of them would eat this diet now because they are no longer hunters and gatherers. Their situation in the world has changed dramatically in a couple of hundred years. But they ate 200 species of plant, 50 species of berries, 25 species of green vegetables. Extraordinary diversity and variety in their diet, which we've largely lost. Even if we branch out a bit and eat asparagus, or we try to eat a bit of spelt as well as wheat, we're not going to get to this kind of diversity in a modern diet. We process a lot of food. And we seem in this country to be particularly taken up with processed food. So ultra-processed food is a percentage of household purchases, and there we are in the good old UK, right at the top of that list. There are all sorts of interesting questions about our food culture and why that is the case. We do not have the same Mediterranean food culture that we see in the south of this continent. So some really interesting issues. And ultra-processed food is a really bad story in terms of diet and health. Exploring food culture, moving on from availability to acquisition. Where do we get our food from? Well, the vast majority of us now get our food, obviously, from supermarkets of one shade or another. That has changed in my lifetime. I amuse my students, I should have put the slide up here, I amuse my students by putting up a slide when I'm talking about these issues of an old-fashioned Sainsbury's, where you walk down a central aisle and you went up to the person on the counter and asked for so many pounds. I remember getting pounds of broken biscuits with my mum when I was little. And they don't believe, and then I show this to them and they think it's something from the middle of the 19th century. And I point out that I remember going into the first supermarket in the town where we lived in Winchester and how exciting it was when I was 5 or 6. And they'd look at me as though I must be far older than I actually am. Well, I'm pretty old anyway. But, you know, there has been a dramatic change in the way we acquire our food. And so in 1950, independent grocers, the kind I remember, accounting for 78% of grocery sales, and now down to less than 10%. Market share by multiple food retailers increased from 23% to 93%. But it is not a static situation, and it's changing again. It's changing in a number of ways. Online sales, UK, 7.3%, second only to South Korea. I don't know why, someone will tell me afterwards why South Korea is right up there in terms of proportion of groceries bought online. So online beginning to challenge, and we've seen that the supermarkets trying to respond to that. It's not only that, it's also actually, interestingly, a little bit of a resurgence in smaller shops. They're often part of big chains, sort of fast food outlets, stroke, quick get your groceries kinds of places. And hey, I don't want to be seen as knocking supermarkets, and I knock supermarkets for some things, but there's been some very, very interesting research that shows poor diet in poor communities that are further away from supermarkets than others. In other words, they're relying on those fast food outlets and those small, very discount store-orientated small stores in poor neighbourhoods. So actually, there's interesting correlation between better diet and access to supermarkets in some of those studies. So it ain't all an anti-supermarket rhetoric at all, but it is about the choices people have, that is for sure. We need to enable people to make the right choices. And go back to that processed food slide, that does not help at all. The manner in which food is consumed. Where do we eat our food? In the report, I just talked about how I had school lunches. It's rung a bell with a number of people of a certain generation. Sitting down every day, and 90% of the day pupils at the school I was at would take school lunches. We thought that the packed lunches were a bit sort of, you're a bit namby-pamby if you bought a packed lunch. You sat down and you ate liver and bacon or cottage pie. It was always meat, it was always potato, it was always vegetable. The pattern was clear right away through my childhood. That was the pattern. And then I went home in the evening and I sat down with my mum and my dad and my brother and we had high tea. Lots and lots of cake. My mother was a brilliant cook. Lots and lots of cake with bread and butter. And mercifully, I did lots of farm work and lots of football, and my figure's not that bad after that. But, the way we eat has changed. lots of people don't eat together in family. I was amazed when I was at UBC, University of British Columbia, at seeing the range of food outlets on a big university campus, much more than at Exeter actually. Huge number of choices of how to eat your midday meal, if indeed you have a midday meal, as opposed to grazing throughout the day. So the way people appropriate their food has changed very significantly. We have an explosion of interest in cooking and gastronomy. Is that a good thing? Interesting question. I have a feeling that for many people, and I count myself within that group, that it's a rather vicarious pleasure looking at those food programs. I don't think I can recall a time when I jotted down a recipe or went online afterwards to get the recipe. It's all beyond me. It's all too challenging. It's all too difficult. I look in awe at this gastronomy, this intelligent knowledge, this culture, this education, and it all feels a bit much. But nonetheless, without a doubt, there is a great interest out there. We need to shift that interest from being a vicarious viewing kind of interest, all those people, those 8.7 million books, into people changing their diet and cooking more and eating more healthily. A revival of cooking is vitally important in this space, in my view. I will get to agriculture at some point, honestly. There are farmers in the audience. I will eventually touch on farming. And I come to the fourth A in this alliterative journey, anxiety. And those anxieties, we've seen them down through the years, haven't we? We've seen them with BSE, with salmonella in eggs. Those are the ones that hit the headlines. Every so often we have a food scare. And it produces a sort of sense of uncertainty in the population. Do we eat beef or don't we? I remember my children, who are now in their 20s, were little at that time. And I remember that agonized conversations in our household with my wife, because we live in West Devon. We support the local beef and sheep farmers. Many of them are our good friends. Do we or don't we carry on feeding beef to our children? Do we follow John Selwyn Gummer as he was then? If you remember that amazing image. Or don't we? And, if you read some of the projections and science at that time, it was scary. In fact, it hasn't come to pass. But the anxiety that can produce, those kind of food scares, is potent and is fixed on one's memory. So the physical concerns, Guy Poppy's here from the Food Standards Agency, I often talk to him about these issues of the hazards that he has to be absolutely on top of in understanding the hazards associated with modern processed, denatured food, but actually hazards associated with ordinary raw commodities as well, like eggs. So it isn't only processing. The social and moral concern, perhaps we don't think about this, but I've hinted at it, haven't I, talking about family life. There is a sort of broad concern about how we eat, and is this sort of eating on the move, this grazing, this ease with which we can get food, is it adversely affecting family life and social mores? I'm probably not alone in this room. This is a particular audience in being people who have continued the tradition of sit-down meals, not in front of the television, but at a table with the family, as seen as in some way a good thing. I mentioned early on about identity. You build your identity, you build your children's identity through conversation. Conversation often works best around food. Sometimes we even talk about the food we're eating and where it comes from. A symbolic concern, a demise of traditional menu, troubling excess of choice, symbolizing consumer confusion, even an identity crisis. We have moved from that homogeneity of diet that we had before, we certainly had in the Second World War and for a couple of decades after, to this profusion of dietary possibilities. And that, at one level that means choice, that means the fun of choice, but at another level it means concern. What does this all mean? What does it mean if I eat this stuff instead of that stuff? Who am I supporting when I make that choice rather than that choice? What does it mean to my identity? Is there a national diet? Does it matter? Interesting issues. Then there are anxieties induced by economic concerns. The power of the retailer. We hear a lot about that, but actually the power of the manufacturer and processor arguably is even greater. One of the reasons for Sainsbury's and Carrefour trying to come together at the moment is actually to challenge the 15% return on capital that a lot of the manufacturers and processors get, and the 3 or 4% return on capital that the big retailers get. So there's a lot of concern about powers of retailer. I think they're so much more obvious, aren't they, than the manufacturers and the processors. So public concern, publicly articulated concern, the concern of pressure groups is often aimed at the retailers. In fact, I think the global food chain is much more complex than the retailers. There have, of course, been very obvious examples of where retailers have, in inverted commas, abused their position of strength, particularly in the dairy sector, and using commodities as loss leaders, milk being a classic one, and all that meant, all the angst that meant for our agricultural industry in the last decade or so. Concerns there that are very important. I think also economic concerns that bubble around the issue of keeping money within rural communities, of finding ways in which to maximize value for rural communities, for farming communities. It's a whole set of economic issues. But if we're talking economics, don't forget the consumers. Don't forget the poorer consumers who, for us, dare I say it, most of us are probably not particularly, well, I know I'm not, because my wife tells me off all the time for not being remotely price sensitive on anything and just going and buying stuff when I want it. But we don't tend to be that price sensitive because most of us are probably reasonably well paid. There are many people in this country, as we know, who have to be price sensitive on these issues. And one thing I think we have to find a way is making sure that good, wholesome, healthy food is affordable, so that people are able to make the right choices. There's obvious ethico-political concerns, and these, you could just add to that list. Animal welfare, natural environment, implications for poorer countries. During my career, I've been told that I can eat the view, I can support particular environments through what I eat, I can support poorer countries through fair trade. I can support animal welfare through going out and buying freedom foods or that sort of thing. And the quality assurance schemes, many of them have arisen as retailers have attempted to respond to these different concerns. And sometimes they can lead to rather perverse outcomes, as we all know. Outdoor pigs are probably very happy pigs. I don't doubt that for one moment. They also have a little bit of a problematic effect on soils and erosion. And so there's an environmental downside. So balancing these ethico-political concerns is a real challenge. I don't think we've always been as well served as we might be by quality assurance schemes, which have just tended on occasion to be just one concern or maybe a couple, and have not been holistic, have not looked at the broad picture. But that's tough. How do you explain a life cycle assessment to a consumer? How do you explain trade-offs to consumers who might be just exercised by animal welfare or just exercised by food safety? These are very challenging. So those concerns I've just gone through are ones that were articulated by Alan Ward again. You can tell that I got into that particular sociologist big time in this study. He was a very fascinating guy. But there was one that I felt he missed out, which I've seen a lot of in some of my research down through the years, is the concern for provenance. The concern with issues of localism and indeed to some extent national identity, which can cut across those concerns. I remember doing some research years ago, probably just before Foot and Mouth, in which we actually went into some rural communities and we asked people, ordinary people, not farmers. Farmers aren't ordinary people, as we know. We asked ordinary rural people what governed their buying and their food purchases. And we found that the local provenance one was really important, was actually higher than a lot of the natural environment and organic, etc. They wanted to buy local. They wanted to support local businesses. I think it's a very powerful narrative there. It can be rather narrow and parochial and, etc., etc. But it's certainly a lot to be said for that issue as well. But the anxiety around provenance again. And again, for consumers sometimes, if you put all these together, it can be very confusing. So on top of all the specific anxieties, you have a general anxiety of total confusion, what's the best thing to do? Which I feel a lot of the time about all sorts of things in life, and I'm sure we all do. But just about how do I make my decisions as a consumer in this crowded marketplace with all these conflicting concerns around? These are difficult. And do we give enough guidance as an industry on those issues? I leave that as a floating question. Right, I've got to move to health. This was my big revelation. This was the moment when I started reading stuff I'd never read before, discovering a whole world of science that I was completely and blissfully unaware of. And you can't go back. Once you read this stuff, once you listen to people like Susan Jebb here in the front row, there's no going back. The science is very, very clear. We haven't been eating the right things. Our health has been affected at a global scale by our diet. That is just a simple diagram about the extent of obesity in populations around the world. There we are, 28% or something, United Kingdom, the red line. And look where we are compared to the others. Would that we were closer to Japan. Yeah? This is, apart from the fact that this ain't very good for people's quality of life, for people's life expectancy, for all the things that make human life worth living, getting out, enjoying things, going to places, being able to do that well, feeling well, all of that. Apart from that, it costs a lot of money. It's costing it's a double burden. It's a burden on business through losing work days, and it's a burden on the National Health Service, which we all pay into. So this is major and big stuff. And interestingly, just in passing in Japan, they basically decided to face this head on some decades ago. And they basically said, no, you're not going to have a bad diet, people. They're a slightly more centrist system than ours, but they basically said, no, it's not going to happen. And they empowered workplace regimes to improve people's health and fitness. They intervened in markets for food, and they made the change happen to be one of the healthiest populations in the world. They can even play football quite well nowadays. Nearly got there, but not quite. And rugby. So the global burden of diseases. Dietary risks in the UK, the leading cause of lost disability adjusted life years. Awful term, just means we die sooner. Premature mortality and disability within the population. And the dietary links are absolutely clear. You can hear all sorts of views on the internet. You can find all sorts of stuff on this, but the basic underlying science seems to me to be indisputable from my cursory reading as a social scientist, I hasten to add. But as far as I can tell, and Susan very kindly read through some of my stuff and pointed out where I got it wrong, it's related to low consumption of fruit, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, seafood, omega-3 fatty acids, milk, and a higher consumption of red meat, processed meat in particular, sugar-sweetened beverages, and low fibre. The message is very, very clear. And the figures are really frightening. Up to a third of deaths in UK attributable to dietary risk factors. Cardiovascular disease, although it's gone down, is still 30%, and that's primarily through medical intervention, not through diet, is still 37% of UK deaths. Type 2 diabetes since 1991 has doubled in men and increased by 80% in women. We are looking at a major health crisis in this country, and it's diet-related. Just one of a number of diagrams that are in the report are intake of dietary fibre and what we're taking and what we should be taking. So, get out there and eat those nuts and pulses. But you probably all do. And it's trying to get that message out to a wider population to tackle this crisis. So that means changing food cultures. It does link to food cultures, this. It means making sure that people are enabled and empowered to eat the right things and want to eat the right things. And the wanting bit is quite challenging at times. The cost of obesity to the global economy, as much as 5% of global GDP. Imagine putting that right. Imagine what that would mean to the public exchequer in this country in terms of all those demands. So if we get back the lost GDP and at the same time we reduce the NHS burden, what could we do in terms of public expenditure on other areas? The hard-pressed budgets, whether it be policing, whether it be agri-environment, whatever. The opportunities of getting this right are actually profound. There's the Eat Well guide, which is, I think, self-explanatory, really. Incidentally, I must just say something about meat, because I know there'll be one or two people that like meat here, and I like meat, particularly red meat from local farms where I live. Grass-fed, demonstrably better for health reasons. Quality and grass-fed. That's what we should be eating, in my view. Michael Lee, who's here in the audience, will undoubtedly, I'd be amazed if he didn't say something about it in the Q&A, because he always does. And he's right to. We have, you know, a lot of this is about balance and getting the balance right. So we come to agriculture. I've chosen some nice pretty images. Devon Longwool sheep, which I used to keep. Devon cattle, which I probably would have kept if it hadn't been for TB, which frightens me off having anything to do with cattle. And that field of oats, that is organic oats. That is in this lovely farm I went to, Graham Slot in Denmark. And that shows that you can produce organic crops without lots of weeds if you do it properly and you do it well. And the farmer I met there was proud that most of his crops not only looked better, but yielded better than his conventional neighbours. I'm not an advocate of organic per se. I hasten to add, I'm totally bought into leaf, as Caroline knows only too well. There's a place for organic and there's a place for integrated. But it's interesting, if organic is done well, it can be dramatically good. So fibre comes from whole grain breakfast cereals. I've already alluded to that. Eat your oats and with a few nuts and spelt and rye thrown in for good measure. Whole wheat pasta, whole grain bread and oats, barley and rye. I got really into the minor cereals. Do enjoy it when you read this. I got really fascinated by spelt and rye and things like that. I've always been fascinated by oats. So eat all of that. Fruit, such as berry, pears, melons, oranges, vegetables, you know, all of them. Not just broccoli and carrots and sweet corn, the lot. Pulses, you know, fascinating stuff around pulses, peas, beans, nuts, potatoes with their skins. That's where the fibre comes from. Actually, quite a few other things come from those things as well. I was told by someone, I'll probably be told, I can't remember who it was, but someone said to me in a conversation before this, if you eat 2 Brazil nuts a day, you get your selenium. Is that right? Caroline's nodding, she knows these things. So, you know, lots of trace elements and micronutrients, which actually we get from meat and we get from dairy and we can get from these kind of crops as well. And we do not get from processed. You know, processing gets rid of a lot of this stuff. It destroys it. It's well, you've got the message, really. I don't like processed food. I won't go on. Now, what are the opportunities for UK agriculture in this, then? The biggest opportunity, I am not here to say farmers go and grow lots of spelt. I'm not going to be so silly as to say that. There's got to be proven markets. What I am saying is there is a massive trade deficit in fruit and vegetable in the UK. It is really, really big. And if you look around, those of us who are old enough to remember what it used to be like when the Vale of, I mean, I know there's still stuff going on in the Vale of Evesham, but, you know, when there were lots and lots of market garden, in my part of the world, a lot of it has gone. Tamar Valley used to be famous for its fruit and vegetables. Various bits of Cornwall, ditto. The Scilly Islands. There are, in terms of ability to grow stuff, there are places in this country we can do that. Arguably, with climate change, we can probably do a bit more. There have been some great success stories in recent years, as some of you know. Whatever your views on polytunnels, my gosh, they have absolutely helped with extending the season for things like asparagus in Herefordshire, for soft fruit. We can do a lot more in this space. There's no doubt about that. Fruit and vegetables is the biggest bit of this, as far as I'm concerned, in suggesting changes to UK agriculture. It's not easy. We'll come to that. We can diversify the cereal sector, as I've alluded to, spelt and rye. That's spelt flour from Gram Slot, the farm I went to in Denmark. Widely marketed, not just in speciality places, but in Rema 1000, which is a discount supermarket in Denmark, sells this stuff and their organic milk. I was tempted to do a straw poll, but I think time's getting on, as to how many people had actually heard of the UN Year of Pulses in 2016. I have to say, I know you have, Caroline, that goes without saying. But, go on, I'll do a straw poll. How many people have heard of that year, 2016? Okay, not bad. Third, roughly. I confess I certainly hadn't. And it's only 2% of total protein consumption in the UK. We've invested less R&D into pulses, and therefore we've got lower yield increases. But it had an impact in North America. Came across it in Canada, in Vancouver. Their campaign, Just Add Pulses in your cooking, etc., etc. 1,257 new pulse-containing products launched in America that year. I don't know how many in UK, but I suspect you could take 2 digits off that probably. So, interesting one that we've really done very, very little with in this country. You'll be surprised to suddenly see this come up. But I want to make it absolutely clear that I am no idealist on this. I'm not asking farmers to do things that are impossible to do. And I fully understand the context of British agriculture at the moment, where the basic payment scheme is such a significant proportion of income. And that, I'm trying to, the colours have come out a little differently, but I'm just trying to get it. It's that one, isn't it? It's basically rather important part of agriculture. Not so for horticulture in the same way, or for specialist poultry. What I'm saying just quite simply here is that agriculture is looking into a very uncertain telescope, as we know that it's highly likely these payments will go. I say highly likely because, hey, if we ended up on a Norwegian model, we might end up having to be a bit closer to cap than we've been anticipating, but that's for another day. But, farmers are highly dependent on these payments, so the level of adjustment that was required in the agricultural industry is very significant. So let me move, before I stop speaking and allow the conversation to flow, let me move towards recommendations from the study. I divided them into 3: policy development, market, and skills, essentially. Everybody says this, and I'm not sure if I add an awful lot to what has been said by many people. We need to develop a food and farming strategy that is about food, as well as about the farming and environment bit. It's about food nutrition. Now, how we do that is very challenging. I think this is the beginning of a new conversation. I have not offered huge amounts here on exactly what that policy would look like. The third one there, agricultural policy should be more focused on health and nutrition. I think that is absolutely the case, but how we do that, I think, is challenging. I'll come up with a few very little ideas for that in a minute. There's definitely a clear policy imperative to support farmers through the transition. So somehow or other, in the next 2 to 3 or 4 years, we have to be shifting farmers, or helping to shift farmers, those who need that help. Some of them are all fine and very good, but it's just the top 10, 15% are well placed. The rest need a lot of help in this transition, a lot of help. And at the same time, we're asking them to do a lot more things. We're asking them to produce lots of wonderful public goods around carbon storage in soils, around flood prevention, around biodiversity, etc., as well as producing food, and not just food in bulk, but food that is nutritious and plays to the health agenda. These are big demands. We need to do this together, scientists working with farmers, working with policy people. One thing I'm absolutely clear about, Charles might disagree with me because we've talked about this before, to me, nutritional security should be seen as a public good. This is not just a private matter in my view. We need to put nutritional security alongside environmental security in talking about the future for agriculture. Sustainable intensification, which I've actually got this far without even mentioning the phrase, but I've spent a lot of my life in the last few years researching sustainable intensification of agriculture. I think the policy and research there needs to be broadened to include human nutrition as a core element. It hasn't been. It's been all about environmental and economic sustainability. Okay, so here's a very specific scheme that will probably fall dead flat with many people, who knows. I think we're not going to interfere, I'm not suggesting we go back to deficiency payments or any direct payments for farmers on these issues. I don't think that's doable now. But a new conversion and/or grant scheme for horticulture would be great. It's really difficult for farmers to move for sake of argument, from corn and some beef and sheep cattle to move into horticulture. You need new different machines, you need storage facilities, etc., etc. Some sort of conversion or grant scheme could be really, really helpful to enable and to allow farmers to make that step. The trade gap means that we can do that with a degree of confidence, in my view. It's not a step into the dark. I think there should be some sort of policy encouragement for cultivation and market development of pulses. Now, again, probably not through market support, but market development. And again, this is where we enter into total uncertainty about what agricultural policy is going to look like. If we end up with anything remotely around cross-compliance, which we may or may not, then something around encouraging mixed and rotational farming would be a good thing. We need innovative and dynamic market structures. Quality assurance schemes, I've already alluded, I think they're a bit hit and miss. They should have nutritional quality absolutely at the core. This is where the retail sector can really, really help in formulating quality assurance schemes with farmers that absolutely prioritise nutritional quality. There's certainly a need for stronger and shorter supply chains, focusing on nutritional qualities. We've got quite a lot of that already. We need more. Food sovereignty, well, I think we should look at some of the lessons. Again, look in my report for more information on what that means. But it means as a nation, as a people, thinking about our food, understanding our food, really trying to get to grips with what it means for our national identity, and where we can grow stuff and grow it well, let's do it. A need to facilitate new entrants into agriculture and upskill existing farmers, really important. Get those new skills in there. A lot of existing farmers, brilliant, fantastic, wonderful people. But, what a strange industry when it's hard to get into unless you've got a lot of money. And there's wonderful educational institutions in this country like Harper Adams and other places producing young people who need to be in that industry. Upscaling or expansion of the Prince's Countryside Fund Farm Resilience Programme. The Farm Resilience Programme of the Prince's Countryside Fund is the best thing in town when it comes to helping farmers understand their businesses, and how to change the way they're doing, how to look at succession, etc., etc. It's just absolutely, if you don't know about it, go online and look into it. It's farmers helping farmers. This is not top-down stuff. It's not old-fashioned ADAS coming in and sort of giving advice. This is farmer-to-farmer work, going through a process of learning and coming out the other side. And the evidence that we have from that is the majority of people who go through that program of half a dozen workshops come out at the other end having improved their efficiency, have improved their family relationships for the future of their businesses. We need to upscale that. We need to roll that out. Because one thing is sure, whatever happens after March 2019, it's not going to be the same as it was 2 years ago. Further development is needed of new communities of practice around food provision. God, the social scientist is suddenly coming out in me. I've tried to hide it. What that means is people coming together to think and learn together. And there's a great role for farmers to work with consumers in that space. I reckon the time must be getting on. She hasn't put up a 5-minute yet. Is it nearly there? Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to finish before time then, probably. Was that the last one? No, conclusion. Okay, so conclusion. We are what we eat. That old cliche, but how true it is. What goes in determines, in many ways, our health, our life, in all sorts of ways. And we eat what is available to us. That's easy to say, but we kind of, as children, how many of you here, like me, I'm not asking you to show hands, have sort of, you must eat what's put in front of you, and it's polite. It was drummed into me, and I drummed it into my children that, it's all part of being polite and being decent human beings, that you eat what's put in front of you. So in a very simple sense, we eat what is available to us. What is available to us has been changing rapidly, and we now have a lot more choice than just to eat what is put in front of us. We don't just walk into the canteen at work and have one choice anymore. So what is available to us is in part what we decide is available to us now. And as consumers and citizens, we can and should change what we eat. Simple. I've said it a dozen times already. I believe it. Farmers have a great opportunity to contribute to the health challenge. No easy fixes, no quick solutions, or the other way around. But slowly but surely changing agriculture to contribute to the health challenge and to the nutrition needs of this nation. I see it as a huge opportunity for UK agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. One of the fabulous things about Michael is he lectures almost in the same style as he chats in the bar at the end of a conference. It really was a fabulous lecture. Thank you very much, Michael. And I have the privilege of being able to sort of initiate a conversation with you for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go for the last half hour or so to a general discussion. And that really was a wonderful talk, and there's so much that one could sort of explore in this. And I guess that I'd like to start by asking you a little bit more what you mean by national security in the sense of nutritional security. Could you say a little bit more about your concept there of what?
Yeah, I could, and I will. What does security mean? Security means being happy, content, confident. So national security means being confident and content that our place in the world is safe, so we have defence for that purposes. It means being confident and content that our people are well looked after, are empowered and enabled to be good citizens in this country of ours. Caring citizens, mutual care, etc., etc. So nutritional security, to me, is part of that broader piece. So it's ensuring that what, as a nation, we eat produces that confident, caring, good life.
So in the sense of DEFRA's recent command document, Health and Harmony, do you see that as a public good?
I do see it as a public good, and you and I have had conversations about this, and what is the distinction between private and public good? I think when economists talk about that, they have a very clear view in their mind that there's this distinction between what is private and public is where there's market failure. I'm not an economist, and so I have a very different view on it. My view is quite simply that we need, as a people, to be pursuing the good life. I come as a philosopher, if you like, the approach to looking for an ethically good life, and it is in the public interest, i.e. in the interest of the nation, the collective, that we lead good lives, that we lead healthy lives, etc., etc. So I think it's emphatically the case that good nutrition and good living go hand in hand and is part of a good life.
But we're sitting here a stone's throw from the Treasury.
Indeed we are.
We're full of dismal scientists peering at the Green Book.
Yeah.
How would you turn that into an argument a policy argument that DEFRA or other arms of government should be investing in nutritional
Okay, so you
security.
yeah, and I'm a pragmatist, as you well know. In terms of persuading policy people, you'd look at the exchequer costs of the NHS. You just look at how much money we are spending, and you look at the lost GDP. That is the economic argument. So you begin to say, as I said in the talk, if you tackle that, you are improving the economic performance of this nation. So there is a strong economic argument, but I wouldn't couch it in terms of market failure. I would couch it in terms of what the nation needs in order to be a successful and competitive nation with happy citizens. It'd be rather nice, wouldn't it?
It would indeed, but I'm going to continue to act the sort of hard man from the Treasury across the road. So that's all very well and good, but unless there's a market failure, surely we should allow markets to generate this public good, which of course we've all read Adam Smith and will happen without any argument. So what is the argument that you would make for government intervention in this area?
Well, I think quite simply because markets are a little bit blunt around the edges. They don't always get things right. And all markets, every market that exists in the modern world is heavily regulated and circumscribed by law and by methods of governance, etc., etc. So there's no such thing as a free market. What we have managed to do over the last 20, 30 years is encourage more free trade, which is very different to free market in that sense. So I think the important thing in that context is quite simply to recognise that we have the markets that we decide we're going to have.
So I think that's an incredibly important point, not only in agricultural sector, but more broadly, that actually we create markets and that one of the role of governments is to create markets. So if we agree with that, then how does that boil down to particular interventions? I'm particularly attracted by your suggestion about conversion grants and conversion schemes to allow people to move to horticulture. Would you like to say some other things that you would actually like to see in the Farm Bill when it comes out?
Well, I mean, in many ways, I think that is one of the main things I'd like to see in the nutritional space. I mean, there may be other views from people here later, but that would be a really, really helpful one because businesses. Yeah, if you're changing your business and you're changing from one commodity to another commodity, there are big costs. We all know that. And the costs of changing from, as I said, from sheep and corn to horticulture are massive, absolutely massive. So unless there's some kind of help, and this is where, the market would do it probably, but over a long period of time. Another area that linked to that might be, so we have a labour issue around horticulture. I'm sure someone's going to raise that if I don't raise it now. And we may have a really difficult labour issue depending on the outcome of current conversations, or we may not. But I suspect in the longer term we'll have a difficult labour issue anyway. Okay, so what about some grant aid towards robotics in that space? The use of, again, the Graham Slop farm I went to in Denmark, organic, normally associated with muck and mystery and very traditional. They were using robots for weeding their onions because they had a labour problem. So I think infrastructural grants really, I think, could be very important.
And I think you could also argue for them on sort of traditional economic frictions, which are a type of market failure there.
Can I say another one?
Go ahead.
Well, again, in terms of the bill, as you know, again, Charles, I'm very exercised by land occupancy and tenure. And I'm very, very concerned about short-term tenancies and share farming on very short term. So we have to have ways of encouraging new entrants with security. And I applaud those estates, one at least of which is here present, but have actually let farms on decent terms in recent times. And we need to get back to that, encourage that. But I think I'm not looking for tenure reform because I think that is just, we never get the right thing. I'm looking for ways of encouraging new people into the industry and encouraging landowners to look at longer-term arrangements, whether it be through FDBT or probably through share farming arrangements. I think finding ways of encouraging that with new entrants is probably one of the best ways to go.
And you've written really interestingly on this in other documents. But what I want to do now is to sort of try and channel my inner Jeremy Paxman and ask you a hard question. So you've talked about encouraging horticulture and encouraging growing of high-fibre cereals, of pulses and things, which I really agree with you. But isn't it the other side of the coin that if you want to encourage healthy food, it makes no sense not to discourage unhealthy food? I'd like to push back on one thing you said, that grass-fed meat is that much better than meat produced in other ways. My reading of the literature, and I suspect Susan and other people here are far more expert in this, is if that difference exists, it's quite small. It's swamped by the difference between red meat and non-meat, and it's swamped by the difference between meat and non-meat. So red worse than white, meat worse than... If one's looking purely healthy, and I say this as someone who could never be a vegetarian, I too love meat. And so aren't there enormous political challenges there that might make Michael Gove or another Secretary of State sort of steer clear from trying to intervene in the market here? And of course, you know that particularly the political situation in this country, where many of you showed in that really important histogram with the effects of single farm payments on different sectors, that some of our most marginal farming businesses are in the livestock.
Yeah.
sector.
Okay. So you're drawing out the inner livestock farmer in me. I mean, yeah, I've been associated with livestock farming one way or another all my life, and probably that bit was speaking at that point. I'll be really fascinated if Michael comes in later, or Sir John, because we wrote a piece together, didn't we, in Nature on sustainable livestock. Look, I suppose my view is that it's not only about nutrition here. It is a broader debate. I think my own personal in terms of what I've done is I eat less meat than I did before, partly as a result of this work. But I try and eat local meat. I try and eat high quality meat. I try and eat grass-fed meat. And I try and support the local community in doing that. So there's issues around social justice for those communities. But there's also a profound agricultural issue here. Yeah, I still think there is a huge role for rotational farming, in which animals eat crop residues and grass within a rotation. They eat clover that is busy putting nitrogen back in the soil, etc., etc. So I'm kind of all for probably less meat, but certainly meat and dairy products in our diet. And for mixed farming. And yes, okay, there are trade-offs there. I agree. Probably if one wanted to be completely risk-averse in one's diet, one probably would cut out red meat. But I'm not that risk-averse, and I think if I eat it in moderation, there's a lot of good things about it as well. I'm sure I know Michael, itching to come, Michael Lee, who's a great advocate of pasture-fed beef, will want to say stuff about this. It's a fudge and it's a compromise, my answer, but it's kind of almost a personal position in a sense. I suppose at the heart, for me, is I really feel for those livestock farmers because they have had a torrid time and continue to do with TB. And there's got to be a future for them somewhere. And I think the quality end of the market and the grass-fed end of the market is the best bit for that future.
But you brought up the issue about sort of social equity. And I mean, there is an argument that food is too cheap because we don't internalise all the costs,
yeah, sure.
costs, environmental costs. But especially coming from a Department of Politics. So what should we do? Should we allow, we may have, well, it's very unclear what will happen post-Brexit, depending on what trade arrangements we have. Should we worry about food becoming more expensive? Should we have safety nets to allow people... Thinking more macro.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, of course we should worry. And that is an incredibly broad question. I mean, we need a more equal society in a sense. We need people to be paid well enough. I mean, we have a very interesting situation at the moment, don't we, in our society, with very, very high employment. For all the difficulties this government has faced and the previous, we've managed to maintain high employment levels despite the economic circumstances. But a lot of that is very low wage. And so we just need to move towards a more equal society in terms, and that's not a party political point, far from it. I think most people would agree we need to empower and enable people who are not earning very much to earn more, and so that they can pay for that food. You know, food banks are a tragic commentary on the kind of society we've now got, it seems to me.
So I completely agree with you there. But just to go off on a slight tangent and to be devil's advocate, and again, thinking of arguments that may emerge from across the road, at the time now where we have this high employment in the UK, which I think no one quite really understands why, isn't that actually an opportunity to restructure a part of our rural economies, which at a time when there is more pressure on jobs might lead to more social harm? Is now not a good time to sort of look at the structure of the industry, look at whether we have too many farming businesses that are not viable, especially if we move outside?
Yeah, I mean, it is. And a passionate advocate as I am of family farming, you know, I'm not denying that there's going to be some fallout in the sector. I mean, I think it's almost inevitable. That has to be allowed and enabled and facilitated with dignity for those people. And where possible, we get new skills and new entrants in as well. I mean, it's quite interesting actually, because I would argue that one of the many negative aspects of the basic payment scheme, which has allowed some farmers to dog and stick and draw it as a pension, has allowed others to over-capitalise and spend too much on machinery. So I think there's probably a little bit, I'm almost slightly arguing against you, and it's probably there's going to be some farmers who fall out, but I think there will be farmers who stay in there. When they look at their businesses without basic payment scheme, they're probably going to think, actually, you know, we can add a bit of value here, we can do things a bit different, we might need just a little bit more labour around the edges, actually. I think we've almost gone too far down that route.
So a final question, and this is around food sovereignty. And one of the things you've taught me over the years, more than anyone else, I think, is the importance of narratives. And isn't there a danger in the narrative of food sovereignty that it can lead back to arguments for production support? It can actually, well, there's an argument that if we encourage people to buy local produce just for the sake of it, then that actually weakens our international competitiveness.
There absolutely is an argument. I think the reason I put it in, and I did it rather cheekily, it's been associated with very radical politics in some parts of the world, and you know, anti-capitalist kind of politics, which I'm not bought into particularly. The reason I put it in is because it was dismissed very much by you, actually, in one of the Foresight reports that you chaired, was this is no place in a British conversation.
I blame Sir John Beddington myself.
Well, yeah, I blame you equally. But I just thought you were missing a bit of a trick, because I think some of the sentiments behind that and some of the thinking about connecting people in communities with farmers, getting farmers and consumers alongside, thinking about where our food comes, all that kind of rhetoric that goes with the food sovereignty movement is well worth us looking. We're not going to suddenly become, you know, radical peasants. We haven't got any peasants left anyway. But we could at least think about some of those principles and think, well, actually, is there a place? And the argument about, I mean, your argument is about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is always going to be there in trade. Sorry, economist. You know, we're not going to move away from comparative advantage. But comparative advantage is determined largely by what consumers want. You know, it's not sort of written in stone that it's cheaper to produce that there than there. There are all sorts of costs that go into those, but also what consumers actually want matters. And if I, as a consumer, and I persuade a number of my fellow consumers, decide I want to eat lamb from West Devon rather than lamb from New Zealand, that's not an argument against comparative advantage. That's just a consumer choice, saying I want to support those farmers. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If that's food sovereignty, then I'm all for it.
So there probably was a more sophisticated argument there that we glossed over. So
I think there might have been.
I am going to now ask for questions from the floor. And Mike Lee. And
he shouts loud enough.
Okay, thank you. Well, Michael Winter's already set me up, so I thought I had to respond. So just refuting your comment, Sir Charles, about pushing back on unhealthy food. Red meat, of course, can be a healthy food. It's all about responsible consumption levels. And of course, that's not to say that you can't have a healthy diet as a vegan. Of course you can. But if you are a vegan, you've got to have a certain amount of nutritional knowledge to ensure you collect all the correct vitamins and minerals. And ensure the easiest way across a whole national diet for a balanced supply of vitamins and minerals is a small, responsible amount of animal-based protein. And I think that's clear.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
I do. The other aspect of that, of course, in terms of red meat, as opposed to white meat, is that it has other aspects of it. It can support rural communities. The bedrock of rural communities are ruminant livestock industries. And these are foods that can be produced without competing for human edible food, which the poultry industry at the moment certainly cannot. So the question is, if we are going to continue to demonise red meat production, how are we going to support our rural communities? And we also have to give a balanced view about other foods which, if not responsibly consumed, are equally as damaging. And these are predominantly plant-based, particularly sugars and palm oil.
Yeah.
So why have we got this continual demonisation of red meat when it should be part of a responsible part of a healthy, balanced diet? I think we'll be much more better placed if we have a more balanced view.
Micah.
I mean, I obviously agree with what you say, because we've talked about this many times. Your question was an interesting question, why? And that is a question directed, I would argue, to political science and sociology and anthropology. Why has this attack come about? Now, there are some obvious, very strong climate change reasons that are slightly different to the food reason that have driven this, and there is some truth in all of that as well. Animals take a lot of land, as we know, but then again you come to the question, why do people not, when they make that, and you and I have talked about these big global land use models that show, we should eat hardly any red meat because it takes so much land, but do not take into account that a lot of that red meat is from land that cannot easily grow crops. Why? Is it just a lack of scientific knowledge from the people that do that modelling and they don't understand different land capabilities? I've had conversations with those people and they say it's too difficult in the modelling. But being too difficult in the modelling is a bit of a rum answer when actually this affects political and social debate. But there are a whole set of reasons in my anxiety of why people have come to. Animal rights movement, hugely important and significant. Veganism, it's come from that concern about eating our sentient beings, a concern I fully respect. So it is about social and cultural changes, really.
And I must say, as a meat eater myself, then I do worry about the language about demonisation, whether it is demonised. We need to somehow find a middle path. Ali. Sorry, in the front here, red dress.
Thanks. Thank you very much. That was an excellent lecture. I am standing up now with my chair of the NFU's Horticulture and Potatoes Board on, and I'm not going to talk about Labour. Quite a few in the audience will be pleased to hear. In the UK, horticulture represents 2% of the farmed land area and 25% of the farm gate value.
Yeah.
If you had a crystal ball and you got your wish, what would you like to see those two figures grow to?
Shall I quickly answer that? I mean, the simple answer is I really don't know. I would have to sit down and do the calculations. But you look at the trade gap, and it's got to be trebled, hasn't it, at least, in order to begin to sort of make a difference. So more. Okay, go on, Tim. Oh, sorry, I'm not the chairman. I'm more than happy to bow to Tim's view on this.
And I've never been able to stop Tim speaking, so please go.
Go on, go for it, Tim.
We only consume 12% of the fruit of the grower. We consume 12% of British consumption of production, and we consume 55% of vegetables from the UK. Both fruit and veg should double.
Yeah.
You're talking about tenfold increases needed for fruit. You're talking about at least sixfold increases needed for vegetables.
Great.
I mean, it's a massive transformation of land use.
Yeah.
On the Eat Lancet Commission, we've done global modelling of this. I mean, you can't have the amount of meat that is currently consumed by the US and UK, for example. I mean, the party's over, basically, unless you want to fry.
Yeah.
It's very stark indeed. So
Thank
the
you.
message is very clear, more horticulture. I thought it was fabulous that you said that. If I may ask, Charles, my question was going to be, well, this evidence has been around for a long time. The modelling is getting bigger and better, but we do not have political leverage. Charles was absolutely right. The Treasury is not interested, and we have a disaster in this DEFRA Health and Harmony paper. Yeah. It only talks about food on the front cover. Yeah. That's it. I've said to Michael Gove, you're no longer Secretary of State for EFRA, you're DERA. The food's gone. You don't talk about food or health.
Yeah, no,
so we haven't got political leverage. How are we going to get it? Labour Party is not talking about it. Tories aren't talking about it. We're walking into Brexit. What's your answer?
Well,
a little question.
You can rely on Tim to come up with a point like that, and he's right. How do we get it? We get it through the health agenda. We have to get it through the cost of the NHS. We have to get... I know you've tried... Yeah.
We've had the evidence given the UK for 10 years.
I know, Tim.
We've got a little bit of change, a little bit of edge of carbon into the Eat Well plate saying don't eat so much red meat and processed meat. There's not real policy leverage.
No,
I mean, very stark.
I agree, and it's hard for me to come up with after all that you've done in your whole career on this issue, and how can I possibly say what we can do? And Susan as well, and all her hard work. All I can hope for, rather than say, I hope that at some point the realities become clearer. And I still think that the NHS bill has got ultimately to be the most likely political lever.
Tim, forgive me, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Just in case there's been anyone who spent the last couple of years on Mars, that's Professor Tim Lang from City University. Question over here, and then Caroline Drummond over there.
Thank you, Chairman. Alan Buckwell, Institute for European Environmental Policy. Congratulations, Michael, in doing what you can to raise the nutritional and health issue, because as we've just heard, I mean, it is key and it's overdue. But I mean, I share Tim Lang's concern and Charles Godfrey's too, that you're not being clear enough on the toughness of the measures that are going to have to be deployed if we're going to have any impact. That is it enough to simply stay with explaining the problems and deploring the cost of the health service? Do we not have to grasp tougher measures? But the other thing that surprised me in your lecture is the absence of the environmental argument, because that you didn't use the word unsustainable. But I'm afraid that's now, after all the years I've spent studying agriculture and food, is the conclusion I'm at, that the systems we're deploying are unsustainable. And this is essentially a greenhouse gas issue. It's also nutrient flows. It's also biodiversity degradation. It's also antimicrobial resistance. There's a catalogue of issues, and I'm afraid to say most of them heavily associated around livestock. So it's not enough to simply resort to, well, I want to carry on eating some lovely Devon grass-fed beef. I mean, the problem is cattle are amongst the biggest polluters. They're the leakiest, the largest in greenhouse gases and in nutrient flows. We're going to need rather more brutal approach to these problems than you're suggesting. Could you comment?
Well, thank you, Alan. We've known each other a long time. Could I comment? Yes, of course I can comment. I mean, I deliberately did not go very far down the environmental route, obviously, because I was asked to be looking at food, and it's difficult to deal with everything in one report and one even shorter lecture. I totally agree with you. As you know, I'm a passionate advocate of sustainable agriculture and really interested in all those issues. The meat thing, we're back to meat, aren't we? I think it is perfectly reasonable for me to say that there is a strong argument in terms of local economies and local biodiversity in continuing to have a small amount of red meat in a diet. I think that is a perfectly reasonable position to take. That means getting rid of feedlots. It means eating far less poultry and pigs because they eat soya. They eat the stuff that we can also eat. But at the end of the day, I think there will be a livestock industry. I think also it's really interesting. We tend to polarize on this issue and get into red meat. What about dairy? They also produce cows that do their stuff with methane. Most people would agree that some dairy is an important part of diet, particularly for children. And I think we just have to find a way. I think what we also need to do, and I think, Alan, I think you're being a little disrespectful in some ways to some of the scientists in this area who've been working really, really hard to try to find ways of reducing the carbon footprint of cattle, to even reducing methane, et cetera, and just trying to have a more sustainable
system.
Not
with huge success.
Not with huge success, no. But it's a journey we have to go. I mean, yeah, God, I don't know. It's incredibly difficult. But we have an industry out there that is really rather important to many rural areas. We have to, in my view, we have to find a way in which that industry can survive in a more sustainable way. Now, I will stop, Charles. I'm all for, within that context, I'm thinking again of Devon and north of England and Wales, finding ways for those economies to diversify. So they don't have to get the very last lamb or the very last beef animal out of that. So diversifying both in terms of non-agricultural and agricultural production. It probably means growing a lot more trees in those areas. In other words, I am talking about reduced meat production without a shadow of doubt. But I do not want to damn the meat industry entirely. It's got, there's going to be gradual change, a diversification of those economies, more trees grown, maybe even more orchards, etc. So a shift, but I don't see meat disappearing overnight. And I think if we adopt the view that meat is the absolute villain of the piece, then in a sense, what do we say to farmers in that context? How do we get gradual and incremental and sensible change if an industry is demonized? I just don't see how we can. I'd certainly like to see a world in which there were far fewer animals being eaten, without a shadow of doubt.
Forgive me, there are lots of hands up, so I'll try and get to as many people as I can. Caroline Drummond.
Caroline Drummond, thank you. Well done, Michael. Very, very interesting and stimulating lecture. Thank you very, very much. You highlighted the trade gap in horticulture, the new proposal for a new conversion into horticulture, but the challenges for the horticultural sector is very tight margins in terms of return on capital, the labour, and then, of course, actually inspiring a desire for people to eat more fruit and veg, not to mention the importance of improved nutrition through soil management, variety choice, education improvements. All of this takes time. And sometimes I think it's a little bit like an old watch where the cogs are just slightly out of kilter. What is it that you see as the real linchpin, the real policy that would just make that change? Have you seen any examples, any pilot studies around the world that actually have just started to make it change so that you, as a social scientist, can demonstrate these are the things that will change behaviour at all sectors of people involved in this problem?
Okay, I mean, that is a slightly different question. I mean, just the first part of your question, Caroline, I mean, in terms of tight margins and all that sort of stuff, yes, but there is a trade gap to fill. So, I mean, I don't, it will be a while before we're encouraging more people to eat more fruit and veg. We could still expand that sector. The encouraging the change in diet, yeah, I mean, there are examples. I mean, I alluded to Japan, where there was a very, very significant change in diet that took place, and it required massive behaviour change across the food chain as well as amongst consumers. So it can happen. I mean, I think the take-up of healthy eating policies has been better in a number of countries. France and Italy are good examples. Sweden. Tim's shaking his head at France and Italy. It's going the wrong way, I know, but it's been a little bit better. Canada's made some progress. I mean, there are no easy answers. I mean, certainly the places where one would look to start are obviously in schools and the provision of food within schools, within publicly procured food in hospitals, etc. That's a good place to start. What Japan did, and the trouble is this is where we're talking about a very different economy and society, they did an awful lot in the workplace, but that was still assuming a kind of, you go a bit like my story of going to school and having school dinners. I mean, people going in the workplace and eating what was given to them. So a much more rigid society than we have here, and that is hard to deal with. There are no easy answers to this, and so it's got to be behavioural change, nudge, 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 changing advertising, much stricter controls over advertising of those foods, public procurement, trying to get obviously dietary information on food products, all that sort of stuff. Every single thing has to be pushed at. Some people would say we just have to be much tougher in terms of regulation. Maybe we should. I don't know. I'm naturally quite inclined towards tough regulation, but we're not living in a society that's kind of like that at the moment. And how far can we push back to more regulation? And it's in the wider public interest. I'm not sure.
Question right at the back, and then I'll go to Ian Hodge in the front there. Is there a microphone?
Yeah,
Oh,
Rob Ward, Growth Accelerator. Going back to the theme then, and exploring the point you just made a bit more, there are unbelievable amounts of people now abandoning whole food groups every day. You could probably fill a football stadium every week with people that are getting rid of and stopping dairy and meat. And we really have to understand and think about that a lot more. This is about a key element of culture. It's become trendy not to eat these meats amongst people under 35s. And here we are in London, which used to dominate the vegan population. Now the whole of the UK is thinking about it, under 35. So the real question is, how can we stop telling our consumers and think about how we're going to sell to our consumers? We've been very guilty as an industry of telling them what they should do. You've touched on a few ideas there, but they were very much telling. What about selling? Sell them the idea.
Yeah, I mean, are you meaning in terms of responding to...
Well, I'll take a parallel. Plastic bottles. There's been no legislation on plastic bottles as a disposable plastic bottles, but people are voluntarily walking around all over London, all over cities with reusable bottles.
Yeah.
And that's happened in the last few months alone because the environmentalists have got behind it, and the message has got through. And that's about selling, not telling. How can we sell? Because telling our consumers what they should do is a really bad idea, in my opinion.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure whether you're saying selling to the new consumers who are articulating their new demands, their new way of doing it, or
it's a trust breakdown, and the trust breakdown has to be fixed. Yeah. And largely it's about welfare, and so you have to reverse that.
Yeah.
And that is not by telling them what to do, telling them that they're wrong. It's about helping them to understand what they.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's partly comes down to this sort of notion I have of building communities of practice. So it's about building relationships. I don't buy the idea that there is a sort of marketplace that somehow exists in isolation to human relations. I wouldn't do as a social scientist. So it is about building trust, and it is about mutual trust and respect. And I do think a lot of the reconnection that is required is part of this. And that's from simple, I don't mean simple in terms of logistics, it's highly complex, but simple as a wonderful idea of Open Farm Sunday, Caroline's sort of idea of getting people onto farms to understand processes, to much, much more complex interactions between people. I mean, you mentioned urban, the emergence of whole food, etc., in urban areas. There's also, of course, the emergence of growing stuff in urban areas, from guerrilla gardening to hydroponics to whatever. Again, different ways in which we can connect to consumers. It might be, dare I say it, that some farmers end up not so much selling food as selling systems. In other words, this is how you produce food, and I can help you do that in your context, in your backyard, on your, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're selling knowledge rather than actually selling a commodity. Because I think more and more people not only will want to eat better food, but they'll want to produce it themselves. And farmers and growers have the expertise, which actually, if you don't have that expertise, it's really, really hard. And I've lost count of the number of times I've been talking to ordinary people, who've just said, "I wish I knew how to grow stuff." I don't do that because I don't really know how to do it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ian Hodge, and could we bring the microphone down to the gentleman in the corner there, Ian?
Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for a really interesting talk. I wasn't persuaded that the chairman had channeled his inner Jeremy Paxman against the speaker's inner livestock farmer. And perhaps if I'd known that Alan Buckwell was ahead of me in the queue, I might not have felt the need to ask a question at all. But what I wanted to do, I guess I'll ask a question first and simply say, do we believe that the polluter pays principle applies? In which case, how do we apply that given the evidence that we've got? But I guess there are two sides of it, and we've sort of come to the conclusion, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years that markets are fine and we don't need to worry about the effect of markets on agricultural output. That we'll cope with public goods, and we could discuss definition of public goods, which I won't go into. But the question is, maybe we should be subsidizing it. If we genuinely believe that pulses and horticultural products are better, and we should encourage people, particularly on lower income. Not everybody's a rich professor who doesn't have to worry about prices. So maybe we should actually be subsidizing those products and encouraging increased consumption that way. Perhaps, and the flip side then would be that we should be taxing some of the others.
I think that's fascinating, Ian. Let me start with the polluter pays principle thing, how to apply that. I've not even thought about that in this context. I mean, obviously very familiar with the principle in other contexts. I mean, the main problem, the main pollution, if you like, is polluting our bodies with these bad things. Who is the polluter? The polluter is largely the food processor. So I guess that's where we get the payback. That's where we try and get some money back to sort that out, or regulatory intervention. I mean, in a sense, Ian, if you can convince other people that we get back to some, I mean, I put in the report we can't really do that because it wouldn't be WTO compliant. If you and Tim Lang and other people can find a way, then I'm all for it. There was nothing actually wrong in some of those deficiency payments that helped stabilise incomes for farmers and encourage production of certain things. You know, sometimes I think I'm too close to the politicians. I didn't even dare say it. You know, I thought, no, it's not going to happen. Yeah, I'd be interested in other views. Should we actually, if we've got freedom and if we can find a way through the complexity of WTO, which seems to be being ripped up all around us by certain people at the moment anyway, if we can get back to having our own domestic agricultural policy, hey, I would be up for that. I really would. And if we're encouraging farmers to produce the sorts of things we want through a deficiency payment regime or something like that, and actually, going back in time, we didn't cause major market problems when we did that before. It was only when we got into the CAP.
An interesting thing, and there is an economic theory of merit goods that you could apply to it, but then you also have demerit groups. And then we get back to this whole issue of demonizing, prioritizing certain food types. Gentlemen in the...
David Blencathra. Michael, thank you for an absolutely excellent lecture this morning. Obesity depends not just on what we eat, but on the overall quantity. I'm therefore concerned about the Eat Well slide, which I think comes from the Department of Health. Yeah. Even if the pie chart shows the correct proportions of the different types of food we should eat, I'm very concerned about the total calorific intake at the very bottom. It still suggests 2,000 calories per day for women, 2,500 for men. Am I right in thinking that has not been changed in 20, 30 years, maybe not even been changed since the war? And I certainly believe it was set at a time when we had a much more energetic lifestyle. So surely part of the problem is to put, if I'm right, put pressure on the Department of Health to completely revise the total calorific intake we should take. As I sit in this wheelchair, if I eat more than 1,000 calories a day, I get fat. And that's just a fact of life.
Thank you, David.
Could we just transfer the microphone to Susan?
Susan can answer that. She's nodding.
This.
I think the recommendations are right. The problem is that most people greatly exceed them. And so if you go back 20 or 30 years, what we saw is that energy expenditure was considerably higher than those recommendations. But I think too often, we worry about the recommendation. Actually, recommendations don't make that much impact on what people eat. And so the problem is not the recommendation, the problem is what people consume, which is greatly in excess of what they need. But you're right that the obesity issue is predominantly of excess calories, and those excess calories also bring too much fat, too much sugar, too much salt at the same time.
I'm not going to forget the person who had the microphone, but given you've got it, do you want to just ask your question, then we'll go to the lady
So
there.
I love the idea, of course, of agriculture as a nutritional public good, and you've given us some really nice opportunities for some improvements. But I guess what I want to think about is how can we ensure that the value of all of those changes, thinking carefully about livestock, boosting horticulture, adding pulses, diversifying cereals, all of the great suggestions you've made, how can we ensure the value of that is not undermined by the processing and marketing of added value products? Because as you pointed out, people eat what is available, and what is available is rarely the core foods. And isn't that actually a big part of what's going wrong in our system?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the snippets I've got in the report is some research that was done. Researchers who examined 100 different processed products in supermarkets, and not a single one, this was in 2012 from memory, not a single one was compliant with World Health Organization dietary standards. So there is a huge issue. So yes, of course, if you coat pulses in sugar or fat, that's not a very good idea. So it does. I can't really imagine doing that, but it does come back to not only changing the sort of balance within diet, but it does come back to cooking and to dietary balance, and dare I say it, to a new food culture. It is about reinstilling in people a desire to eat well, not just on a special occasion when we go out for a treat, but on a day-to-day basis. So it is about food culture. That is about behavioural change, but it is about cultural change, and it comes back to all the points I was making about families. Some of you will say, "Well, you're just, there's no chance," but I think we have to just begin. It does come back to the fundamental issues of why are we here. I know people, oh gosh, he's just been going off on one, but what is the purpose of our life? What is the good life? What are we doing on this planet? Are we just here to sort of go out and buy some gassy fizzy drink as we walk to work or something? Or are we here to actually enjoy life in all its rich variety? From the food we eat to the relationships we have within family, within community, etc., etc. And to me, the role of government has been neglected in this sense. We've lost that sense of public purpose, that sense of what is a good life. It's all about economics, and it should be about what are we here for.
And it's interesting, these were questions that Keynes would talk about,
Yeah.
that have sort of gone from...
And Adam Smith as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, Michael, thanks. Again, it was a fabulous lecture. And I have two kind of different questions. My first one is about regulation and government and responsibility. And it seems to me there's questions to be asked here about the role of the Food Standards Agency and the separation of food safety from nutrition. And I think we need to, critically discuss that. And my second question is about food culture, and I'm the proud owner of two 20-year-old boys who, like their generation, are very caught up with their body image. And this seems to me to involve consuming frightening amounts of protein and red meat, actually. And they don't seem to be alone. This seems to be their peer group, and their food culture is very much tied up with this body image, and very much a huge consumption of red meat. And I just wonder about that age group.
I mean, that's fascinating because something I didn't say in the talk is our consumption of red meat in this country has, of course, been falling quite significantly. So we are, I read quite a bit of work about the so-called millennial generation, which, of course, 20-year-olds are precisely that. There seems to be very, very mixed views and mixed evidence. So for everyone that's concerned about body image and therefore pumping themselves for red meat, presumably to get lots of muscle, there seem to be an awful lot who are much more concerned about the health aspects. I think it's about competing ideologies in this space, isn't it? I mean, we've not even mentioned social media and the digital world, but this generation are getting their knowledge and their self-understanding and their identity in that way, rather than just in the peer group they happen to live with on a day-to-day basis. So that is producing a great diversity and a great churn. I'm not sure if it's easy to really yet discern. Again, this when I was at UBC and I was looking at these youngsters, as one does, as in the universities, they're all over the place, you can't avoid them. And some of them were going to the really healthy food places, some of them were going to the ethnic food, a Lebanese little place, which was wonderful. And others were eating awful stuff, And you sort of think, well, what? Because I didn't go up and ask them. I mean, I wasn't there. I would have been told off by the University Ethics Committee if I had. But, what is it that makes you, as a young, 20-year-old something who looks much the same as that 20-year-old something, why you're going for the Lebanese or the very healthy stuff, and you're going for the hamburger? And there's all sorts of diverse churning and mix going on there. That's really. But I'm interested in the body image. Therefore, I eat lots of meat. One is quite a fascinating one. Food Standards Agency, Guy Poppy's here, he can speak for them. I mean, and he probably will in a minute if we want him to. But it seems to me that the Food Standard Agency, it lost its responsibility for nutrition in England and Wales, retained it in Northern Ireland, part of the weird fudge of devolution. Scotland is doing its own thing in parallel to the FSA. I would absolutely like to see an FSA-type organisation that had nutrition at its heart as well as safety and standards. Guy probably can't even comment on that because that's a political issue.
Well, channeling my mystic Meg, I'd actually line Guy up to ask the next question. So, Guy.
Yes, I mean, I think the issue is in terms of nutrition. My role as an advisor is to kind of advise on things, and you can imagine how you could offer advice as to why nutrition, which is part of having a healthy lifestyle, should be in the food category or should be with an organisation that promotes physical activity and a whole range of other things which promote healthy lifestyle. So it kind of depends which one of those you think is going to contribute to better public health. The question I wanted to raise was what one sees quite often here is when you are articulating particular characteristics of a system which would be desirable, people are relatively supportive, and as soon as it starts kind of entering towards the worlds of solution, which is going to affect people's agendas, people start arguing. And the same is true to do with GM, conventional, organic, a whole range of things in which many people accept that the global food system is broken for a range of reasons, and people have very heated debates as to what they think is the solution to that. Taking that one step further, I was in fact actually at this building when the Rand Corporation launched their report called Truth Decay, which is building on the concept of fake news. And if you want politicians or society at large to kind of follow you or make decisions accordingly, which is largely what, Michael, you were saying was necessary, to coin a phrase of somebody you mentioned earlier, it's not great when they see experts arguing. So I'm just wondering how we can move towards more articulation of the characteristics that are necessary, and then you can give out messages about that, and whether it be for the public, the market, or politicians, to know what the goalposts are that there's large agreement about, but perhaps have different views in terms of the solution to that. Because, to me, that is the problem. It's just a very, very confused message. People say, I'm hearing one thing one day and another the next day, etc. What do I do with this? I'll just get on with business as usual.
Yeah, and I mean you're right to say that there were powerful disagreements when it comes to the implementation of change. Those powerful disagreements are often based on huge interest. I hesitate to say the word vested interest because they're genuine, but they can often be financial interests. And we have to have a mature debate about that in which we understand that some of the changes required will impact on the very powerful interests that have invested so heavily in the global food system that we have. my ray of hope in that is that big businesses are capable of seeing and responding to change. And many of them already have. And I think it is possible to envision a future in which some of those big corporates that we now see as really on the wrong side of these arguments just accept that change has got to come and respond accordingly. I would like to see a way in which the mainstream is changed incrementally in that way and through challenging those people, but also a bubbling up from beneath of totally alternative ways of doing it. In other words, I'm a capitalist and an anti-capitalist because I'm a pragmatist, because that, you know, the big global food chain is not going to go away. Those big interests are going to be there. I will talk to Syngenta and all those organizations each day and every day if they want. And, you know, I've had conversations with them. They have moved and shifted in certain ways. But I will also encourage the local food schemes, the community-supported agriculture and all that stuff as well. And somewhere out of all that, we will come to a new place at some point. I'm not a revolutionary because I just think that that's not going to happen. But we're going to have change, that's for sure, big change. Sorry, I'm burbling on now.
Well, we've actually come to the end of
have we?
the major time, but I have permission for 10 minutes of injury time. And
as long as we don't go to penalties, I don't mind.
You beat me to the joke.
Oh, sorry.
But what I'm going to ask is for a lot of people want to say things. If you could make your comments very brief, and I'll take 4 or 5 of them and then come to Michael to finish out. So gentlemen right at the back and then to the left. But please do it as briefly as you can so we can get quite a few comments in.
Chris Harrop from Longley Farm, dairy producer up in Yorkshire. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. It seems to me that as we drift towards less animals, higher welfare, and higher price paid for it, and we hope that helps all sorts of things like people becoming more engaged with farmers and farmers being less nervous about showing intensive production systems and all these positive things that it would be nice if it happened. My question is, do we think that is, and I know this is a debate, but I'm interested in your opinion on it, Michael. Do we think that's a consumer-led thing that drives different demand in supermarkets and other food retailers, or do we think it needs government intervention to protect our farmers trying to do things higher welfare from incoming cheap imports? And if so, is that likely?
Thanks very much indeed. Gentleman to the left here, and again, brief if possible.
Campbell Tweed from Northern Ireland. I'd like to comment briefly, first of all, about Japan. And the difference between Japan and this country, in my opinion, is that the Japanese aspire to excellence, and that runs right through their society. In this country, follow on really from Caroline's comment about how do we persuade the people who really need to change behaviour and demand. I mean, we can talk all we like about supply, but if the demand side isn't right. And one of the things I've learned is that in the university in Northern Ireland doing a lot of work in nutrition, they can get volunteers for virtually every kind of diet except dealing with obesity. People who are obese will not even stand on scales in a university department, let alone become engaged in work. And
thanks very much. And if we could go to the lady there.
Hello, Anna Jones, 2016 Nuffield Scholar. One word hasn't cropped up, which I think dictates what we eat more than anything, and that is taste. I love sugar, I love fat. Most people love sugar and fat. How are we going to connect on that thing?
Thanks so much. Yeah. Great question. Gentleman in the red tie. Red tie there, and then pink shirt afterwards.
Sorry, thank you. James Small, Somerset Farmer. I'm just wondering if part of what we've all been hearing today could be formulated around language. Do we need to start moving away from talking about cheap food to affordable food and good value food? The cheapness creates connotations in people's minds, and I think it's caused many of the problems that we've seen within our food supplies. Should we really now be talking about good quality, affordable food?
Thank you.
John Stones, If you looked in the shopping bags of people coming out of my Waitrose on a Saturday morning, you'd think that your message had been very clearly received. When I travel through a street in Glasgow, which has got burger shops, kebab shops, and fried chicken bars, and as Campbell Tweed has just mentioned, people who are going to be very reluctant to engage, how is the message going to trickle down to the people who, probably as a social group, put the biggest burden on the other services?
Thank you. I think we're going to have to stop there, so go over to Michael just to round up.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously can't deal with all of those, really, but in order, I mean, I don't think it's an either-or on consumer-led and government intervention. I think it's got to be a combination of both. So that's a cop-out answer, but I happen to believe it to be true. I mean, your point about government intervention, really cheap imports, yeah, I mean, this is an absolute dilemma. I mean, we've in the pig sector, you know, we have a transformation of the pig sector based on farm animal welfare. So that those who've responded to that as pig producers are doing okay. The cheaper end have lost out to imports. We come back to Ian's point, maybe actually we want a domestic policy that deals with that more rigorously. And we do have the opportunity, if we're outside CAP, to think about that one. I take, the point about the reluctance of obesity people to be involved. I mean, that was a comment, really. Taste, I should have learnt my lesson. I had a Chinese student in my master's class 3 or 4 years ago, and I'd been on and on and on about the sorts of stuff we're talking about today, about changing consumption and all these kind of issues. And she suddenly, at the very end, she said, but it's very straightforward. This stuff tastes better. And because I'd been talking about why China's diet had changed and, you know, how it had affected international commodity trading in soya and all this stuff. Yeah, taste is important. I mean, I think when you read the report, you'll see I do talk about cooking and taste, and I think I've alluded to taste in terms of the good life and enjoyment and all those kind of issues. Yes, it's important. Yes, but the issue of the stuff that that is bad for you tasting good, I think also the stuff that is good for you tastes good as well. And I think that comes back to cooking and to culinary things and to education, etc. You know, I think we all know if we give small children bad things, they develop a taste. You can actually get small kids to really enjoy good things as well. So it goes right back to the beginning. How we cultivate and educate our taste, I think, is important. You know, it's like that in all things, isn't it? You know, I mean, you know, music, for example. You know, I'm glad I'm no longer only listening to 1960s pop music, which was okay at the time, but I came to educate myself and enjoy Bach and Boccherini considerably more. It's, you know, you've got to expose yourselves to these possibilities. Gosh, why did I say that?
I do happen to know that Michael is a singer, so perhaps you might like to finish off.
No, I have no intention of doing so, especially not with my voice, as you've heard, it's gone. The point about language and moving away from cheap, I 100% agree. Whenever I hear the term cheap food, I recoil. I hate it. It has all sorts of connotations and raises all sorts of sort of false dichotomies and false binaries. Yes, it's got to be about affordability, and it's got to be about value and quality. The last point of all on Waitrose, if I knew the answer to that, you know, I probably would be doing something else. It is really, really difficult. We're back to some of the main issues that we've been talking about in this session. Really, is how do you get people to change, particularly that part of the population that is very reluctant to do so. I'm not an expert in any of that stuff, you know, but it's got to be something in the territory of sort of advertisement and behaviour and education. It's going to be a long, hard haul. And I don't think there's any easy answers. And it comes back to the point from Northern Ireland about, you know, there is a particular issue here of people who've got themselves into a place that they don't want to be, but sometimes they can't even admit that they don't want to be. And how you deal with that is really, really hard. But certainly some of the evidence, my final point, Charles, that I alluded to, is where, even in very poor populations and socioeconomically deprived populations where those issues are higher of obesity, that where there's access to better food, things do begin to turn up do change. It's on the turn. So there is evidence that, at least some people will shift in that context if they have the access, if the food is available. It's not an easy answer, but we have to, I think we do have to look at the geography of food provision and affordability alongside accessibility in ensuring at least people have the opportunity. Waitrose, sadly, are closing some of their stores, I believe, when they perhaps should be opening more. But we have to have, the geography matters in this context.
So what you've seen from both Michael's lecture and from his conversation and answers to questions is astounding insight into many of these issues, but also real passion and caring. So I'm about to hand back to Louise, but before I do that, please join me in thanking Michael for such a...
Thank you. Before I just say all the thank yous for the end of today, I found the whole process today brilliant. When I'm at a dinner party and I say to people, I'm in food policy, I watch them glaze over if they haven't met me within about 5 minutes. Anyone who's been in this room over the last 2 hours will know the energy, the vibrancy, the passion of people that are involved with food policy. The aim of the Nuffield Farming Lecture was to position many of our aims as a trust. One is to drive thought leadership, another to lead positive change. And I feel today, with our first Nuffield Farming Lecture, we have really driven that agenda. We have looked at 3 key themes that Michael has questioned us to adopt: policy development, innovation and dynamic market structures, and enhancing skills and developing communities of practice. I'd like to think that everybody in this room can find some space in those 3 areas that Michael highlighted to take away something on their to-do list. Thank you to Great George Street and the chef who has been encouraged to produce local and seasonal food, which hopefully we're about to have. Thank you to our sponsors. Without you, it would have been all but impossible to put on the event and to host the scholarship. So thank you to Meryl Ward and her family. Thank you to the Frank Parkinson Agricultural Trust, the John Oldacre Foundation, and the University of Exeter. On behalf of the Nuffield Trust and everyone in the room. I'd also like to thank you for the questions. They were thought-provoking, and Michael was not given an easy time. And when you're in the audience, that's always nice, not quite so much when you're sat at the front. So, before I do the final thank yous, I've got up behind me the next title for the 2020 Nuffield Farming Lecture. 2.5, 3 years ago, when we thought of this title, we didn't realise it would be quite so apt. We wanted to take on all the themes and have a golden thread from all the work that was done before on the Arden Scholarships as we've gone into Michael's lecture. So, the largest retailer in the world has no stores. The largest taxi business in the world has no taxis. Taobao, the largest online fresh food platform in China, has 500 million users. So, with that in mind, and to carry on a lot of the themes that Michael has brought out today, our next title of our next Nuffield Farming Lecture is Brick to Click: How Will the Retail Revolution Impact on the UK Farmers of Tomorrow? So if anyone wants to find out any more details, it will be appearing on the website very soon, or please ask me over lunch. But I have 2 thank yous left. Thank you to Sir Charles for chairing this session today. And our extreme thanks to Professor Michael Winter, our first Nuffield Farming Lecturer. Thank you for an outstanding report, an outstanding presentation, and answering the questions with the insight that you have. Thank you very much.